BNG is the law, but 1 year on, the system is still in chaos. Small sites are caught in the crossfire and exemptions are being gamed. Local authorities, they're drowning in paperwork. In this episode of Ask the Arb, we're exposing the hidden traps in the BNG process and what to do about it before your planning application stalls. Hi folks, welcome back to the Ask the Arb podcast. So before we dive into this episode, another one on BNG and how the system is still in chaos. First, we're going to go to... You've got the questions, the planning system's a nightmare. We have got the answers. Welcome to the Planning Permission Panic Line. So folks, planning permission panic line, and the reason why I am going to this bad boy first is because I've got a question in from Liam in Manchester, and Liam's question is in relation to BNG. So Liam messaged me on, no he didn't, he replied to one of our, I do a weekly newsletter, and if you want a copy of that, reach out to us, we can get you on the list. We send out 25,000 emails every Sunday, Monday, and Liam's basically replied to one of those. And he says, can I just plant a few trees to hit biodiversity net gain and avoid the extra costs? If not, can I fell the trees that are on site and replant them once I've got planning consent? So let's deal with the latter point first, Liam. No, you can't. The last episode I talked about Google Earth and how Google Earth had been used to scupper somebody's appeal on the basis of satellite imagery, and the same thing would apply in this case. If the trees have been there until fairly recently, then the local planning authority will basically, they'll use Google Earth, they'll have a look, and they will see that those trees were in place when your planning application went in. So I wouldn't recommend that. By the way that you're talking, the tonality and the way it's written, I think this is probably a householder application. So it may be that there are exemptions in there from BNG anyway. I would reach out to your chosen ecological consultancy and they should be able to avoid you on help you on that. But in terms of planting a few trees, yeah, I mean ultimately that is one of the ways that BNG can be met on site, but it depends what habitats you're losing. It's very complicated. The whole metric is extremely complicated, and basically there is no easy answer to this. You need an ecologist to handhold you through. Sorry about the door banging. This studio is in my office, and the door outside is smacking backwards and forwards, which is somewhat annoying. What else have we got here? Mike in Slough, another reply to one of my emails. He is wondering, we're hoping to build a few houses on land that's going to be cleared. Is that a problem for the surveys? Well, it's not a problem for the surveys. It makes it a lot easier if the land has been cleared. Unfortunately, again, Mike, it depends when the land was cleared. If that land was cleared within the last couple of years, it could be a problem. There might be, and this is where a lot of property developers fall into a bit of a trap, which is why at Rover we tend to offer pre-purchase advice on these sites, because ultimately what tends to happen is, you know, you could in good faith buy a site that's been cleared within the last 6 months to a year, and then all of a sudden you find that you've got problems from a BNG perspective, because there might have been quite high quality habitat on site. Could have been, you know, lowland, deciduous woodland, could have been bramble scrub, could have been something that attracts quite a high rating within the metric, and the site, you think you're buying a cleared site, but it has to be baselined at what it was before the clearance, and that baselining has to be done off historic records, which may be patchy at best. So again, not really a straight answer to that one, Mike, but I think it isn't going to be a problem for carrying out the surveys, because it makes it easier in some respects. What it could be a problem for is BNG, if that forms part of your if you're liable to that. What I would recommend is getting some solid advice early on, and a lot will depend on the type of application as well. If it's self-build and you're exempt from BNG, then you'll probably just need to demonstrate biodiversity enhancements to comply with local planning policy. So that is that one. So back to the episode, and in this episode we're exposing the hidden traps in the BNG process and what to do before your planning application stalls. So why should you care? Well, you're going to need to consider BNG unless you are genuinely exempt, and even then it's worth checking. What we tend to see is that a lot of local planning authorities in England, which is where this all applies at the moment, Scotland is slightly different, and Wales is slightly different, but in England at the moment, your local planning authority, even if you're exempt, they might ask you to demonstrate you're exempt by going through the BNG process. So what does the BNG process look like? Well, essentially the site has to be baselined. We have to find out what is there. And a bit like, imagine it as a pile of bricks, essentially. We're going to look at that pile of bricks. We're going to assess those pile of bricks. We're going to see what number of bricks there is. And then we're going to see how many of those bricks you take away to develop the site. And we're going to look to see if we can make up the shortfall on site, or whether you're going to have to look at off-site credits. Possibly not the best analogy I've ever come up with, but there we go. So we're looking at the baseline of the site. So an ecologist will have to come out to site. They will carry out a walkover. They do a walkover survey of the site. They will habitat conditions score the various different habitats on site to see what kind of quality they are from an ecological perspective, what species are there, all that kind of good stuff, and then they'll compare it with the post-development figures, and then they'll come back to you with a report and with a copy of the metric and some plans, and they'll say, look, this is where you're at, this is what you need to do moving forwards. And I think it's worth pointing out at this point that local planning authorities, they are rejecting dodgy exemption requests, essentially. So if you're putting in a self-build and it's not a genuine self-build, they will ask you to enter into a legal agreement to basically prove what is going on with that. So one to be aware of, they are catching on to these dodgy exemption claims. You also don't want to think that you could deal with BNG post permission, because that is quite a gamble. We see that sometimes with protected species surveys, where people think, well, we'll highlight there's an issue and then we'll deal with it post planning. Most local authorities want all this dealt with up front before you submit. So when we are talking about when we're talking about 10% gain, how do we go about getting that on site? So let's imagine a green grass field. Let's imagine you want to put some glamping pods on that field, which is going to involve infrastructure. It's going to involve some car parking, some tracks, the actual physical footprint of those glamping pods, for instance. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that you are going to be taking away from that site. You're going to be taking away grass, you might be taking away some trees, etc. So in order to get 10% above baseline, you need to give back, and you need to give back with a habitat that's either the same value or higher value. So in terms of that grass field, it may be that you fence off part of the field. You call that your sort of habitat enhancement area. It has to be outside of the development of the curtilage so that it couldn't have a Section 106 agreement put on it. And you might want to plant an orchard. Nut trees in particular, they attract quite a high rating in the metric. It may be that you want to put a little pond in or something like that, but you need a area to offset what you are doing. And if you haven't got that space on site, it can become very, very tricky. The other thing I want to talk about, I touched on it just now, but is self-build exemptions. That exemption is being abused, and my gut feeling is that will probably be removed. It might get removed in the planning and infrastructure bill. I don't know, but we'll see how that goes. But we certainly have had to provide some fairly detailed and heavy documentation to support some of our customers just recently to prove that it is self-build. I didn't really want to talk about this, but I think I probably need to. And there are some nationwide ecological consultancies, of which ours is one as well. And the problem is with nationwide, and although we're a nationwide company, our ecologists are local to you. So somebody within 100 miles of your site would be coming to your site if it was Rover. But there is there's always a balancing act between commercial requirements and what is best for nature and what's best for the client. And what we have seen is some ecologists fudging, I think is the word that I will use, fudging the baseline metric to avoid gain obligations. And local authorities are wise to this. They will go through the metric with a fine-tooth comb. They will compare it with other sites that might be on the same street or very close by. They've got a detailed local knowledge, and they're going to look at that. So do not be tempted to fudge the metric. There is something called the small sites metric, which is designed to be filled in by non-ecologists. I suspect that might get changed. There are various online tools that will help you with the small sites metric. The problem is with the small sites metric is it tends to be overly cautious. So it gives a higher rating to some things than perhaps it should. Reason being is that they are trying to protect the process from non-qualified non-ecologists filling out the form. So it's always better to use the full statutory metric if you can, rather than the small site. You may well just end up wasting money by trying to go down the small site metric route. The next thing before we go to our interlude is the difference between on-site, off-site and statutory credits. So on-site essentially means that you can meet the 10% plus requirement by carrying out enhancement of existing habitats on site or creating new. That is always preferable, and that's what the intent of the legislation was. If that can't be done, you could look at off-site. So there are various habitat banks scattered throughout the UK. You really need to use one in your local area, but there might not always be one there, and they will basically, for a fee, carry out enhancement on one of their sites that will be accredited to your scheme. That is generally where most of this is going at the moment. And then the final one is statutory credits, which is the government scheme. So if there aren't any habitat bank providers in your local area, then you may be forced to go down the statutory credit route, which is horrendously expensive. Just a brief sort of anecdote. We did see one developer list gravel as a habitat on their baseline survey to keep the value low, and it worked until the council, basically the planning officer, took it to their LPA ecologist, and they deep dived into it, and they found that there was problems right the way throughout the metric, and they had to redo the whole work. So our next feature is... Hi folks, it's time for You Couldn't Plan It, the feature where me and my team have scoured the internet for stupid, silly and downright infuriating planning related facts. Let's go. Yes, that's right, let's go. So this one is quite funny. This is from Sky News. And this is September a few years ago, but I thought it was worth revisiting because it is quite amusing. The headline is, in typical Sky fashion, it says, "Your proposal is whack. Council worker mistakenly rejects planning applications with sarcastic comments, but decisions are legally binding." So this particular person here, Amy James, she received a sarcastic response to a planning application she had submitted in January, but they have now become legally binding. It says here, one applicant, a charity boss, was told by Swale Borough Council her plans were turned down because your proposals are whack, with a second comment adding, no mate, proper whack. 5 applications for Swale Borough Council were affected, as well as a 6th from Maidstone, which was rejected with the reasons, don't even bother reapplying, lol, and I'm not even joking. Amy Jones, owner and founder of the Happy Pants Ranch, submitted a planning application after the animal sanctuary moved to a new piece of land in January, and there is a screenshot of the decision notice, and it genuinely says the council hereby refuses planning permission for the above for the following reasons. Your proposal is whack. So yeah, that's interesting. And the lady goes on to say, we did not have anywhere to go, and a lady offered us this piece of land. She told Sky News, when I opened the planning document, I nearly had a heart attack. The reasons given were just bizarre and incredibly unprofessional. The 36-year-old continued, I didn't know whether to be... Why do they always put people's age in there? How is that in any way relevant? What a load of nonsense. I didn't know whether to be angry or cry. The comments were just laughable. I just don't know who the person who wrote that was thinking, blah 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 blah. The funny thing about this, so you're probably thinking, what a load of nonsense, Matt. You know, that a bit of an overreaction to a few comments. The problem is that most people, when they're going for planning, they are deeply emotionally locked into the process. There is normally, they visualize the outcome, and the outcome is going to be life-changing, whether it be an extension to their house, whether it is a new animal sanctuary, whether it is, you know, somewhere to keep their horses, change of use of agricultural field to equine or something like that. So, you know, and it takes a very long time to get through the planning process in most cases. So, you know, when you get something through like that, it is desperately poor. You know, it's a massive kick in the teeth. The Kent Authority has come back and said that a testing error occurred, which published dummy decision notices on 5 randomly selected swale applications on the live system. After the council was alerted to the mistake, the decisions were removed from the site. So, you know, it could well be it was a mistake, but at that point, damage was done. So there we go. That's that one. So let's go back to our episode on BNG and get this bad boy wrapped up. So essentially, what I would like you to take away from this is that if you don't know your baseline of your site, you're already way behind. Make sure you ask for a real metric, the real statutory metric, not the small sites metric, unless it's a really simplistic site. Get advice really, really early on. Get ahead of the game. Don't get buried in enforcement letters. That is not the way you want to go with that. So I hope that has been useful, everybody. A little overview there of BNG and the BNG process, and I will see you next week.